One day, when it was time for my vacation, I decided to go to the countryside to visit an old friend I hadn't seen in years. It was a long drive, and I even had to stop by the side of the road to sleep. But I promised to visit him when I had the chance. I was already on a dirt road that led deep into the village. As I drove past the low houses, I searched for the address I was looking for, and soon I saw what I was looking for. In the past, Frank had always come to my aid when I asked him to. Now he asked me to come and stay with him. He began to build a new house, and soon he showed me his construction. I inspected it carefully and agreed to stay here for 2 weeks and help him. A few days later, my wife, Emily, who called me every day, bored, decided to come visit us. She and I had always had a strong, good relationship. Her job didn't keep her in town, and she bravely came to visit us. Emily had a great talent for cooking, and she decided to spoil us with goodies while we were building the house. We had a wonderful time, but sometimes I noticed that she got a little too close to Frank. He was a widower, and Emily, with her kind heart, often offered to help. This began to worry me. I knew Emily was always friendly and caring, but their interaction seemed unusual. I was beginning to lose confidence in our relationship, and fear was engulfing my soul. I decided to muster up the courage to talk to her. "Honey, he's my friend, of course, but I think you care too much about him." I began gently. "Are you really jealous?" "Oh, come on, I'm only trying to help. You're overreacting." "Emily, I'm serious." I put my hand on her shoulder, and I looked her in the eye. "All right, all right, all right, I'll be careful what I do, but you're too jealous." She kissed me on the cheek in return. We spent a few days like that, alternating between construction work and evening fun in the backyard or at the cafe. The crew of hired laborers helped us a lot, and lastly, there were a few finishing jobs that we could already handle ourselves. And by the end of the second week, the house was ready. It still reeked of paint and varnish inside, but we decided to celebrate the completion here in the backyard. Emily immediately checked the kitchen to see if it was working and delighted us with her cooking. We settled with the barbecue while Emily needed help, and Frank, with his hands free at the time, followed her. They were gone for a while, and I was beginning to get worried when Emily came outside with a tray and was smiling broadly from the doorstep. The housewarming party had gone just fine, and the next day, my wife and I decided to go home. "Why don't you stay a few more days?" Frank suggested politely. "You still have some free time, don't you? Don't you?" "I wouldn't mind, but I have some business to take care of at home. But I was very happy to see you and to help your business. But it's time to go back." We started to pack our bags as Emily abruptly bent in half and screamed in pain. I flinched in surprise, but when I quickly realized what was wrong, I quickly rushed to help. "Honey, what's wrong? How are you? What's wrong?" I picked her up in my arms and held her onto the bed. "I don't know, George. It really hurts," she moaned. I took the phone out of my back pocket without wasting a second and started dialing the number of the ambulance. Frank came running in at the scream, his eyes bulging as he wondered what had happened. It didn't take long for the ambulance to arrive, and Emily was taken to the local hospital, which wasn't perfectly equipped. But the doctors and nurses were very caring, and my wife was treated and well cared for. As it turned out, she had nothing serious. She had only been poisoned by the fumes of paints and varnishes. But nevertheless, I was hardly ever away from her, and Frank didn't leave her unattended either. "Friend, I don't want to burden you. You should go home. You must have a lot to do. You've got things to do around the house, don't you?" I suggested when we went to the vending machine to get our own coffee. "No, no, how could I?" He spoke with concern in his voice. "After all, in a way, it's my fault here. It was in my house that she got sick. I want to help. I know what you mean, but she's better now. Thank you for your concern. I'm sure she'll be discharged very soon. Okay, suit yourself, but call me if you need anything." We said goodbye, and I went back to my room. The doctor stopped me halfway there. "I'd like to talk to you. It's serious." I even became alarmed at his words. His face did not look calm. Your wife's residual tests came back, and we suspect a tumor. But unfortunately, our equipment is not the newest, and I would recommend you to be examined at a more specialized clinic. I felt my heart freeze in my chest. Tumor? The word pierced me, causing a wave of anxiety and fear. I could not believe that such a disease could befall my wife. The doctor's words cut short the joyful atmosphere that had just reigned between us. I returned to the room, and there Emily was, already sitting on her bunk, ready to be discharged. I didn't want to overshadow her now. I asked the doctor in advance not to say anything to her. I said I would tell her myself. She looked pretty happy now. I helped her pack, and we went back to Frank's house. Yes, that's the news. I shared my sadness with my friend as he and I went out on the terrace for a beer in the evening. How could this have happened? I'm very sorry for you. If there's anything I can do to help, don't hesitate. Thank you, man, but I think it's already our burden and we'll try to cope. We'll leave tomorrow and I'll let her know at home. Oh God, no, Emily cried out when we got home. Why didn't you tell me right away? How could you keep it from me? Honey, don't worry, I'm sure it'll all work out. Maybe the doctor was wrong and you're fine. How could I be okay? It's over for me. Do you understand? Emily was always afraid of getting cancer. Her mother had ovarian cancer, and my wife was well aware that she might have inherited this terrible disease. But I wouldn't let her give up, and soon we were being examined at a private clinic. I spared no money for that. Deep down, I hoped that the initial diagnosis was wrong, and we were both anxiously awaiting the results. I was a little surprised when I saw Frank outside the room. "What are you doing here?" I walked up to him. "George, I couldn't stay away after all. You're my best friend, and Emily is no stranger to me. I'm worried about you both." Honestly, such excessive concern didn't seem quite normal to me, but right now all I could think about was my wife. The doctor called me. That what he said pleased and saddened me at the same time. He told me there was no cancer. He said that Emily was pregnant, but that she had complications that could severely affect the pregnancy, and there was no guarantee that she would carry the baby to term. I didn't know how to react at that moment, so I just thanked him for the information. Frank, standing off to the side, wanted to know what the doctor had said, but I didn't want to share the news with him now, and went to Emily to talk to her about her condition. "George, that's wonderful. We're going to have a baby." She even smiled. "But the doctor said that. It's going to be okay." She interrupted me. "We're going to be fine." I hugged my wife. Later, I shared the information with a friend. He congratulated me and wished me to participate in the care. He offered his support and some material help, which was just right, but I didn't really want to become dependent on my friend. A few months passed. Pregnancy, as the doctor predicted, went with complications. Emily went to the hospital time and again to be preserved. Frank stayed with us in the city and paid a lot of attention to Emily. I even wondered about his behavior sometimes, as if he were taking care of his wife, not mine. Frank himself had been widowed a few years before. His wife had been hit by a car and he hadn't seen anyone since. At the time, I visited him and supported him mentally as best I could. Now I thought he was thanking me for keeping him from going off the rails back then. The birth was hard. They had to do a C-section. The doctors had to work hard to keep Emily and the baby alive. I never left the operating room. Frank wasn't far away either, and when it was all over, the nurse came out and congratulated me on my son. I was over the moon, but there was no reason to be completely happy yet. Emily and the baby were too weak. She was left in the room for further observation. Her son was placed in a special nursery. A couple of days later, he got worse. He had a heart defect, but the doctors managed to save him. I couldn't bear the sadness. Emily was getting worse too, and they put her on a drip. Frank supported me as best he could. A week went by and my son began to recover, but Emily was not getting better. Her condition remained stable and she had lost her milk. The doctors talked me into going home and getting a good rest. All this time, I left the hospital only to go and change clothes, take a shower, and get my wife's necessities. Frank stayed with her for this time, instead of me. At work, I asked my partner to take things into his own hands for the time being. Soon I was allowed to take the baby out of the hospital. I brought him home, hired a nanny, and visited Emily periodically in the hospital. But one day, as I was sitting by her and trying to comfort her, the nanny called me in an anxious voice to tell me that the baby was not feeling well and she had already called an ambulance. I demanded that she go with him and bring him here. Meanwhile, I found a doctor who organized an appointment for my son. When they brought him in, I could only make out his flushed face. The doctors took him away. An hour later, the doctor said that the baby had a disease whose name I could not remember and that he needed a blood transfusion. I agreed without hesitation, but soon I was struck by the news that my blood was not suitable since I was not the father. I froze in place. How? How was that possible? I rushed over to Emily. I realized that she wasn't just being nice to Frank. I had asked the doctor to check his blood. I had called Frank on the phone to the hotel, but I hadn't told him the reason. Emily, tell me, is it true? Is it true I'm not the father of the baby? Who? Who's the father? The baby's life was more important to me right now. George, I'm sorry. I couldn't tell you. I made a mistake, but I didn't want to ruin your friendship with Frank. So I was right, and they went behind my back. I never expected them both to betray me like that, but at this point I wanted the baby to get better. When the tests were confirmed and Frank had given his blood for a transfusion and the baby's life was already out of danger, he came up to me and began to express his regrets and asked me to forgive his weakness. It was as if Amara had come upon me. We didn't see each other for long, but I fell in love with her and I couldn't resist it. Let's not talk about that now. We'll talk about it later. I'm worried about my son. I may not be his biological father, but I love him and I'm not giving him up. You go now. I want to be with my family. Frank obediently obeyed, realizing his guilt while I stayed in the hospital, accepting the bitterness of the terrible truth and wondering how I was going to live with it. After a couple of days, when my son's condition began to improve, I was still in no hurry to take him out of the hospital again. Leaving him in good hands, I arranged to meet Frank in the evening at my home. Having bought some whiskey on the way, I met him already waiting at my house. We went in. I offered him a drink. He kept apologizing for what he had done, but I was now overwhelmed with pain and resentment. I had never expected such a thing from my faithful friend. Now I no longer had a friend. I could not forgive the stabbing in the back and was determined to avenge the grief given to me. We continued our conversation. Frank continued to beg my forgiveness, and I sat staring at one point. After a while, Frank grabbed his heart. He felt that he was getting worse, and in a hoarse voice he asked me to call an ambulance. I only turned my head in his direction. Do you really think I'm going to save you after the way you killed our friendship? I watched him gasp in pain as his eyes rolled deeper and deeper under his eyelids, and soon he wasn't making a sound. I carried him to his car, put him in the front seat, and got behind a wheel. When I drove out of town, I put him in the driver's seat, wiped down all the places I touched, and pushed the car into a ditch. I made it back to town on foot and caught a cab there. After cleaning myself up, I went back to the hospital to visit my family. Emily got better for a while, but soon the ailment returned. The first thing I wanted to do was to visit the baby. As I approached the nursery, I took him in my arms. He looked at me so innocent and hummed something to me. I knew I couldn't leave him. Those tiny fingers squeezed my finger and wouldn't let go. Soon the nurse came in and said it was time to feed him and asked me to leave. I obediently left and went to see Emily. When I entered, she was lying on her bunk, pale as chalk, dark circles forming under her eyes. Tell me honestly, what did the doctor say? Am I going to die? Yes? With a hint of hope, she asked me. I went over to her and sat down next to her. In her hand, I squeezed it tightly. Emily, my darling Emily, what can I tell you? The doctors are doing everything they can, but do you deserve to live after what you did? You weren't going to tell me anything. Did you think it would remain a secret? Our son is sick because he inherited Frank's heart defect. He almost died because of you. Can you live with that?" I looked intently into her eyes without letting go of her hand. She was horrified to realize her guilt, but answered nothing. I left her room, having first cut off the medicine from her fore. Several years passed. I raised my son and loved him as my own. I taught him everything I knew, especially that you should never trust someone completely.